Story 1. A group of Chilean miners survived for more than a month, more than a mile underground after a collapse trapped them in the mine. Rescuers were able to drill down to the refuge where they hoped some men had taken shelter. They found the men there and gradually brought them up through the hole one by one in a special capsule. This was likely the deepest mine rescue ever by a long shot. Story 2. The rugby team that survived a plane crash in the Andes Mountains in the 1970s survived by eating the deceased. It is an incredible story despite how gruesome it sounds. Story 3. World War I trench warfare was absolutely horrifying. Poison gases, poor ventilation, and no way to manage human waste meant it was everywhere. More people died of dysentery than anything else, and being trapped with someone dying of dysentery is its own horror. Story 4. The Shackleton Antarctic expedition from 1914 to 1916, during which his crew survived 2 years trapped in ice without a single death. Story 5. As a teenager, I was interested in the lifeboat survival genre. There are several books about people who spent more than a month at sea in a raft or lifeboat. Survive the Savage Sea was a memorable one, as were the raft and 117 Days Adrift. Story 6. The survivors of the Confederate prisoner of war camp at Andersonville. Most of the prisoners of war were effectively slowly starved to death. Story 7. The Black Death was one of the most traumatic and frightening events in history for those living at the time. Surviving when everyone you knew died must have changed everything. Young and old, none were safe. Story 8. Napoleon's retreat from Moscow. Most of the soldiers died, but many somehow managed to survive and made it back to friendly territories or France. Story 9. Read In the Heart of the Sea by Nathaniel Philbrick. The true story of Moby Dick. A whale sinks the Essex in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. 3 lifeboats filled with crew are set adrift. One boat makes it with 2 survivors. They resort to cannibalism. The captain eats his nephew. It is a crazy story. Story 10. This story stuck with me. The following is inspired after listening to George Takei give a lecture on how United States Japanese citizens were treated in World War II. The article tells the story of a group of men who, for the most part, were regarded by the United States as being little better than the enemy. Perhaps their most amazing battle happened on the Gothic Line. The Gothic Line formed Field Marshal Albert Kesselring's last major line of defense in the final stages of World War II along the summits of the northern part of the Apennine Mountains during the fighting retreat of the German forces in Italy against the Allied armies in Italy commanded by General Sir Harold Alexander. The men of the 442nd Infantry Regiment came up with a daring idea. Their commanders realized that while the forward parts of the mountain were heavily defended, the backside of it, a sheer cliff, was not. A company of the 442nd then volunteered to climb the rear of the mountain and to attack the enemy from this point, taking advantage of the fact that the Germans would not be expecting an attack from there. Late at night, they began the climb, slowly working their way up the treacherous 1,000-foot cliff. Not all made it. Many fell to their deaths, but they did not fall screaming. They fell silently. These men knew that if any sound was heard from this area, if any German sentry happened to hear the sound of a man screaming as he fell to his death, then the attack would fail. So they climbed in silence and they died in silence. The men climbed for nearly 8 hours, losing close to half their number to falling. Just before daybreak, they reached the top of the mountain. Hunkering down, they waited for the sun to come up and then pressed their attack. The Germans were caught by surprise, and that one company managed to not only take the hill but break the back of the Gothic Line. A 6-month stalemate was broken by the 442nd Infantry Regiment in roughly 32 minutes of hard fighting. When the war ended, the 442nd Infantry Regiment held the distinction of being the most decorated military unit in United States military history. I cannot even imagine the level of discipline and total self-control you would need to have to not scream as you fell off a mountain to your death. Also, to the survivors who had to keep on climbing after seeing the risk firsthand by watching their fellow soldiers die. They had to finish the mission or their brothers in arms died for nothing. Story 11. My grandmother's village during the Great Chinese Famine had to eat insects, tree bark, and even soil. Most of them survived. Surprisingly, many are now in their 80s and 90s and remain strong. Story 12. Millions entered the National Socialist German Workers' Party concentration camps. Many died there, but some made it out alive. Some are still alive to this day. It is worth listening to them. Story 13. Trail of Tears, along with other forced relocations, resulted in many people not surviving. However, the community endured as a whole. Story 14. The Wager Mutiny. Especially if you're interested in Shackleton, read Grant's book on it. A British ship disappeared while attempting to round Cape Horn or find Drake's Passage in the 1740s. Years later, some of the crew returned to London with one story, while others from the same expedition came back with a different tale of mutiny. The way these men survived is some of the most hardcore endurance I have ever read about, with the survivors in many ways surpassing Shackleton's crew despite the large number of deaths. I don't want to spoil it, but the story gets deeper and deeper into how hardcore, brave, and selfish humans can be. They simply refused to quit. Story 15. Please take a look at The Long Walk. It is a memoir by a Polish prisoner of war who escaped from a Siberian gulag and walked 4,000 miles, basically the width of Russia, home with a group of fellow escapees. It has been adapted into a good film starring Ed Harris and Colin Farrell called The Way Back Home. Definitely worth watching. Story 16. The crew of the Endurance survived 2 years in the Weddell Sea after their ship got stuck in the ice. Then the ice tore the ship to shreds, so they had to camp directly on the ice until it started melting. They then took the lifeboats all the way to Elephant Island. From there, the team leader, Ernest Shackleton, took a crew to South Georgia to get help from whalers. The settlement was on the eastern shore of the island, but they beached their craft on the west coast. They made makeshift cleats and completed the first crossing of the island, a feat not repeated for about 40 years, to reach the nearest whaling station. There is a great book recounting the expedition. It is amazing how they all survived. Only one man had to have a limb amputated on Elephant Island due to frostbite. Story 17. The Wreck of the Batavia. A story of shipwreck, mutiny, betrayal, murder, and, in the end, justice. A Dutch East India Company ship called the Batavia was on its maiden voyage to Batavia, modern Jakarta. It hit a reef off an isolated archipelago off the western Australian coast. Most made it to the small islands, but there wasn't any fresh water available, so they could only use what they salvaged from the wreck or collected from occasional rainfall. The captain and a few others jumped into an open sailboat to try and find water on the mainland. If they couldn't, they were going to sail to the city of Batavia to get help. They couldn't find water on the mainland, so they sailed to the city. This is an amazing tale of survival and seamanship. Meanwhile, back on the islands, the man running the show, who was planning mutiny and to seize the ship before it hit the reef, began to consolidate his power. He divided the survivors and sent them to various islands under the pretense of searching for fresh water. He directed his fellow mutineers to start killing various people on the main island where they had set up. This developed into wholesale mass murder on the other islands where groups of people had been sent. Women of age were generally spared to be used as sex slaves. However, a group of soldiers sent to a larger island found fresh water and food. These soldiers were not part of the mutineers and kept signaling to the main group that they had found supplies and to come and pick them up. No assistance was sent. They eventually learned of the mass murders from escapees from the other islands. They prepared defenses for the inevitable showdown. Eventually, the main mutineer decided to attack this island. There were a series of small battles where the mutineers were prevented from gaining a foothold on the island. Help eventually arrived from Batavia, and it turned into a battle between the survivors, who wanted to tell their story, and the mutineers who wanted to take over the rescue ship. The survivors won. Justice was swift and harsh. However, 2 younger mutineers were marooned on the Australian mainland as punishment. Story 18. One that still amazes me is the 2018 Thai cave rescue. A boys' soccer team and their coach were trapped deep inside a flooded cave system for more than 2 weeks after sudden monsoon rains cut off the exit. They had no food at first. The oxygen levels were dropping and the only light came from headlamps during rare rescue visits. Divers had to navigate dangerous, pitch-black underwater passages to reach them. Getting everyone out required an international team of specialists. In the end, every single person survived, even though the situation seemed impossible at the beginning. Story 19. Captain Bligh and the crew were abandoned to die in the South Pacific by Fletcher Christian and the mutineers. In an extraordinary act of seamanship, Captain Bligh navigated to the Dutch East Indies, a voyage of over 1,400 kilometers in just a small boat, and not a single man died. Story 20. Immaculée Ilibagiza survived the Rwandan genocide in 1994 by hiding in a bathroom for 3 months with 7 or 8 other women. The pastor who hid them was able to give them enough calories to barely keep them alive, as spies monitored how many groceries people bought. They were nearly discovered several times. Story 21. The very young children who survived the Mountain Meadows massacre in Utah had to be bought by federal troops who arrived in force to retrieve them. They were captured by the Mormons in Utah who committed the massacre and killed, or ordered the killing of, the parents in collusion with local native tribes with whom they shared the stolen goods from the wagon trains passing through. After killing the parents, trail guides, native scouts, and all older siblings over the age of 8, they then stole all the children's and family belongings, distributing them to other townspeople. The ransoms paid by the federal troops were for food, clothing, and shelter allegedly freely given to the children by the caretaker families in town, who claimed they saved these children and hoped to adopt them someday. Story 22. The 1996 Mount Everest disaster. Although not everybody survived, John Krakauer, an established writer, was on the expedition and survived to tell the story beautifully in the book Into Thin Air. It is probably my favorite book of all time. Story 23. The Harriet Tubman-led Underground Railroad is a powerful example of enslaved people escaping brutal oppression, navigating dangerous terrain, and risking everything for freedom, with Harriet Tubman guiding many to safety despite constant threats. Their courage and resilience under unimaginable hardship changed history. Story 24. The Bataan Death March. Many people died, but the stories of survival were even more harrowing because it seemed impossible that anyone could have made it out. Those people had nothing to fear after that. They had already seen hell and the worst of humanity. Story 25. I know we are all fascinated by Shackleton and the Andes plane crash, and rightfully so, but we cannot forget the Everest disaster from the 1990s. The one Outside magazine writer John Krakauer actually survived. He wrote an incredible book about it called Into Thin Air that simply cannot be missed. Story 26. The open boat voyage of Captain Bligh after the mutiny. 4,000 miles through the South Pacific in 47 days in a 23-foot-long skiff carrying 18 men. Story 27. The transatlantic slave trade brought unimaginable hardship, followed by the remainder of their lives facing severe suffering. Their descendants continued to endure unimaginable hardship for centuries. Story 28. The Irish potato famine was a devastating event in which millions died when a blight struck the potato crop. It is considered genocide because the potato was not their only food source. Yet the English sent other food supplies offshore to feed their troops in India. Some food, however, did make it through. Story 29. In 1856 New York, a group of about 600 members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints followed their prophet's command to migrate west to Salt Lake. It was much too late in the season to travel in July, and they were given green wood to make their handcarts, which meant the carts would warp and break as the wood dried. They were woefully unprepared due to both lack of experience and the limited capacity of the handcarts. Along the way, people's shoes wore out and they had to wrap their feet in rags. Women gave birth on the road. The wood of the handcarts split, and people were forced to leave their belongings along the trail. As the weather became colder and the group was increasingly delayed, rations were cut until each person was allowed just half a cup of flour a day, a quarter cup for children. By November, the winter had become deadly. Livestock and people alike succumbed to the freezing temperatures. Eventually, the group sheltered in a place in Wyoming called Martin's Cove. There are stories of livestock freezing to the ground, lost fingers and toes, and people falling asleep beside loved ones and waking up next to frozen corpses. The deaths among these pioneers skyrocketed from the 8% average to 24%. In the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, this is not regarded as a cautionary tale or a criticism of the prophet, but as a story of admirable faith and resilience. It is seen as inspiring. Look at what these people endured for their faith. One day, followers hope to have the honor of suffering for their God. This former member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints thinks the whole tragedy was insane and completely avoidable. Story 30, one of the oldest. The March of the 10,000, chronicled in Anabasis by Xenophon, who was there and became one of their leaders. In 400 BC, 10,000 Greek mercenaries fought for the Persian pretender king. They won an important battle, but their king died. Now they were stuck in the middle of enemy territory, and everyone was out to get them. Their march lasted 2 years, and a significant portion did not survive. Story 31. I would imagine the Trail of Tears is the perfect event for this prompt. Granted, not everyone involved survived, but a significant number of people did. It was genuinely a tragic and deeply disturbing event. Story 32. I was scrolling through YouTube Shorts when I saw a video about the Titanic. This made me wonder what other events in history demonstrated human perseverance. Story 33. My great-grandfather Harry was at Gallipoli and survived. He spent some time recuperating in a military hospital. Then, as soon as he was better, he was sent to the Somme. He survived that too. It doesn't feel like a defining feature of his life in the way that, for example, surviving the Titanic might be. Many people witnessed the war, but I do think that surviving both battles at such a young age must have had a profound effect on him. Story 34. Obscure occurrences. I think of the South American soccer team that survived the plane crash in the Andes Mountains. There was a movie about it called Alive. Then there is the group of school children from Chowchilla, California, who were kidnapped and buried alive in 1976 and held for ransom. Story 35. Dancing Plague of 1518. Hundreds in Strasbourg danced for days. Some collapsed, and officials hired musicians to help them dance it out. It made everything worse. Story 36. The March of the 10,000 Greek infantry mercenaries in 400 BC marched into a Persian civil war and ended up on the losing side. Their commanders were assassinated as part of a peace parley, so they voted for new leaders. They then marched 2,000 miles through enemy territory to the Black Sea and then to Greece. On the way, they improvised missile units such as slings and bows and arrows, and cavalry, even though they were only foot soldiers to begin with. Story 37. The wreck of the Batavia off Western Australia involved about 340 people on the ship. Around 100 died in the shipwreck. A further 125 were murdered by one of the senior crew members. It is an incredible, albeit horrific, story. Story 38. A lot of people think Ireland and Britain have always been friends. What makes you think the same people who colonized many foreign lands left the little island next door alone? Fat chance. There's a phrase we Irish like to mention: 700 years of oppression. Besides the famine, which they portrayed as us being overly dramatic as usual, in the years leading up to it, land was taken from native Irish and given to British settlers. Then the Irish were hired back onto their farms as workers. By the time of the famine, 5% of the land was owned by Irish, no Irish language was allowed, and our culture was suppressed. We had to have Catholic Mass in the bushes and keep our language alive under the threat of death. Look up hedge schools if you want to learn more. Irish history is full of failed rebellions, usually small and isolated to one area. Great pride and heart but lacking manpower and firepower. These were usually led by Catholic priests. In 1916, there was a strong effort to organize the whole country. It failed to clear the last hurdle, but its impact caused the ripple that finally led to independence. When people say the Irish are so nice and happy and full of life, it's because misery was forced upon us for 700 years. That is why we are also so accepting of death. Story 39. Willem Barents and his crew in 1596. When their ship became stuck in the ice near Nova Zembla, they built a house called Het Behouden Huis from the remains to wait out the winter and return when the ice melted in the spring. 12 of the 17 survived. Story 40. I find shipwrecks fascinating. The whaling ship Essex, the raft of the Medusa, Shackleton's Endurance, and the Indianapolis. It is my dream to one day go to the Louvre to see L'Oiseau de la Méduse. Forget the Mona Lisa. Story 41. The Armenian genocide and the Holodomor, anyone who survived, whose descendants are still with us, is a testament to survival and strength. Story 42. Since the original poster asks about survival, nearly everyone in the wagon train that gave Death Valley its name did make it out alive. They owe their survival to two men, William Manley and John Rogers, who walked from Furnace Creek in the Death Valley Basin, the only fresh water in that entire valley, across the Mojave Desert to Los Angeles to get help. They brought horses and mules, only one of which survived the return journey, but they figured out a route and where to find water along the way. The children rode on the one mule. Everyone who trusted Manley survived the ordeal. However, soon after Manley and Rogers went for help, disputes broke out among the members of the wagon train about whether they were being abandoned to their fate. A few struck out on their own. Most of the party were farmers, not frontiersmen like Manley. When Manley brought the party across the desert, they passed the remains of their former friends who had tried to cross the desert alone. Manley later went to the California gold fields, made his fortune, and bought 250 acres of land in San Jose, California, for $4,000. He wrote an account of his adventures in his book Death Valley in '49. Story 43. I used to live in a sanctuary city that took in many migrants who were displaced due to civil conflict around the world. Some of the children I knew and spent time with included lost boys of Sudan and Bosnian immigrants. They were the kindest people I have ever met. Story 44. There are many significant examples of wars and genocides, including but not limited to the Trail of Tears, residential schools, slavery, the Holocaust, the Cultural Revolution, the Khmer Rouge, the Rwandan genocide, the partition of India, Abu Ghraib, the Japanese occupation of Korea and mainland China, the Irish famine, the Sudanese Civil War, apartheid, segregation, the Spanish Civil War, the Chilean, Argentinian, Spanish, Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, Hungarian, and Russian fascism. The pogroms and the Inquisition are also notable. Human beings can be very cruel to each other, but we can also be kind. How we recover as a society from these horrors is what matters. Story 45. The Bataan Death March Survivors. Sadly, two notable survivors, William Dias and Dick Bong, died in plane crashes back in the United States. Edit. I stand corrected. Dick Bong saw an extensive amount of combat but was not a prisoner of war at Bataan. Story 46. Most of the countries that Germany occupied in World War II include Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, France, Poland, and the Czech Republic. Poland especially faced many hardships during the war. Now, it has recovered to become one of the strongest nations in Europe. Story 47. One story that comes to mind is Harrison O'Keefe, who was a chef aboard a tug in the Nigerian offshore oil fields. His ship capsized and sank. 3 days later, the recovery divers came to repatriate the bodies from the tug, which was resting upside down 100 feet beneath the waves. One diver must have been shocked when one of the corpses grabbed him, as Harrison had survived almost 72 hours in a small air pocket. He could not be rescued immediately. They had to make plans to bring him to the diving bell so he could decompress safely, but he was rescued. He has since conquered his fears and become a deep-sea diver, installing and maintaining oil and gas equipment in waters up to 50 meters deep. Story 48. The Endurance Shackleton Expedition. 28 men were stranded at the South Pole from 1914 to 1916 for 1.5 years. They had nothing to eat but seals and fish. Just imagine the gear they had during that time period in freezing conditions. The crew's survival is incredible in itself, but they also sailed for days to reach the next island in the Antarctic on a lifeboat, a remarkable accomplishment. Another notable event is Uruguayan Air Force Flight 571. Story 49. Touching the Void. Two climbers have an accident in the Andes. It is a talking head documentary with reenactments. You know they survive because they are talking about it, but you still keep thinking, what an awful way to die. Story 50. Ernest Shackleton's voyage on the ship Endurance, forced to abandon it when it was crushed by ice in the Antarctic, and his eventual return home without losing a single crew member, is an unbelievable but true tale. Story 51. The nurses who were held as prisoners of war by the Japanese on the Philippine island of Corregidor were given only a subsistence diet. Any animal that wandered onto the grounds was used for food. They lived this way for 2 or 3 years. Story 52, Jonestown. I knew a reporter who went to Guyana when it happened. He volunteered because he was originally from there. When they needed the seats on his plane to evacuate injured people, he stayed with the dead. He lit a campfire and watched people who had fled into the jungle walk back into the compound. I cannot imagine what they went through or how they recovered. I cannot imagine how he recovered. Story 53. The Israeli hostages from the October 7th attack endured torture, rape, psychological abuse, and humiliation. As of today, 20 of them are still being held in captivity and are slowly dying of starvation. Story 54. Just finished reading Endurance about Sir Ernest Shackleton's expedition to Antarctica. Cannot believe what they all endured. Story 55. Historical accounts indicate that approximately 14.5% of the enslaved Africans forced to endure the Middle Passage died during the voyage. This represents about 1.8 million individuals out of the estimated 12.5 million who were forcibly transported across the Atlantic. It is crucial to understand that this number only accounts for deaths occurring during the ocean journey itself. The death toll does not include the countless Africans who died during capture, forced marches to the coast, or soon after arriving in the Americas due to the brutal conditions of slavery. Story 56. The Jewish people. Enslavement in Egypt. Spanish Inquisition. Pogroms. Holocaust. Still alive and thriving. Story 57. I guess only part of the time was a group, but Louis Zamperini. Story 58. I doubt it truly compares to many others, but the starving time at Jamestown was very grim. Story 59. The USS Indianapolis was hit by Japanese torpedoes. After the sinking, sharks attacked the men who survived. Story 60. The Lost Battalion. The United States 77th Division in World War I had 9 companies surrounded by German forces during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. For a week, they were bombarded by the enemy while having little food, water, or ammunition and suffering friendly artillery fire. Of the 554 men who were surrounded, 194 were rescued. The rest were either killed or captured. Story 61. Immediately thought of this. A 16th century expedition to find a northern passage to Asia stranded on Nova Zembla and was forced to spend the winter there. 5 of the original 17 crew members perished. Story 62. I can't think of any group surviving more incredible hardship than the Endurance expedition led by Ernest Shackleton. Story 63. The Donner Party, American pioneers stranded in a harsh winter, trapped for months. They faced snowstorms and starvation. Only 47 survived of the original 81. Story 64. During the children's blizzard in 1888, a schoolteacher saved herself and all her students after the roof blew off her schoolhouse. She used string to tie all the students together so nobody would get separated and lost in the blizzard. They trekked to the nearest farmhouse, which in rural Nebraska was not that nearby. The teacher's name was Minnie Freeman. They survived. Story 65. When I was growing up, there were numerous airplane hijackings, and I remember sitting in front of the TV and radio with my parents, listening to what was going on. We are talking about the 1970s and 1980s. This was one of them, and it was aired live on TV almost the entire time. The Lufthansa Flight 181 hijacking in 1977 ended with a successful rescue operation by the German counterterrorism unit GSG-9, leading to the safe release of the hostages. The hijacking was carried out by the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, abbreviated as PFLP. The rescue operation, codenamed Feuerzauber, Magic Fire, resulted in the death of 3 terrorists and injuries to 1 hostage. Story 66. Ernest Shackleton led an expedition to Antarctica and made several poor administrative decisions, such as buying the wrong kind of boat and delaying the voyage by 6 months to return to England and salvage his marriage after being caught in an affair. This resulted in the entire expedition being stranded in Antarctica. They stayed on the boat until it was destroyed by the ice, then traveled across the continent, making a makeshift sailboat from 2 salvaged lifeboats. They sailed across the most treacherous sea, landing on the wrong side of the island they had embarked from. They then had to climb over a massive mountain, where Shackleton returned to the house he had left from and asked for a cup of tea. They eventually rescued everyone. The only casualties were a stowaway who lost a foot to frostbite and the dogs that were killed. For food, when they caught the stowaway, they joked that he would be the first to be eaten. Shackleton also accomplished one of the greatest feats of nautical navigation by using a single sextant bearing in the middle of the most dangerous sea and managing to reach the correct island. Story 67. Stories from former slaves have a profound impact. Many of their black brethren endured sadistic punishment and grim fates. The barbarism and inhumanity inflicted upon them is unspeakable. Yet they persevered and retained their dignity and humanity despite every effort from their captors. My personal favorite story is that of Robert Smalls, who was incredibly sharp-minded and courageous. He went on to become America's first black senator among many other achievements. Story 68. Nanjing Massacre. Do yourself a favor and only look it up if you can handle some really awful events. It was not just the killing. Story 69. This will probably get buried, but I haven't seen the Chosin Reservoir campaign during the Korean War. The battle was 120,000 Chinese soldiers versus the 1st Marine Division. Under bitter cold, with ammunition running low and the threat of encirclement, the Marines had to retreat while maintaining a rear guard and trying to cross a bridge. At one point, the bridge was blown up multiple times, so the United States had to keep building more bridges. It's a shame the conflict is so obscure compared to the Vietnam War. Story 70. Holodomor. Deliberate starvation of the Ukrainian people by Joseph Stalin. Ukraine had the food, but Russia took it all. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.